Picture this, you're closing up shop for the night. It's been a long day at work. The sun is setting and you're alone in the store, counting the register, preparing to lock the door and head home. You hear the chime of the entrance. A customer walks in. You turn around to greet them with a tired smile. And those are the last seconds of your life. In the spring of 1992, this nightmare became reality for 6 innocent people across the American Midwest. Shot execution style in the back of the head. No warning, no mercy. Just cold, calculated murder. The killer vanished like smoke on Interstate 70, leaving behind grieving families and detectives with nothing but questions. That was over 30 years ago, and he was never caught. Tonight, we're diving into the darkest corners of American crime, cases that keep law enforcement awake at night, families frozen in permanent grief, and communities living in the shadow of an invisible predator. These aren't stories from history books. These are ongoing investigations, active cases, real killers who walk among us right now, free, unidentified, and in some cases, still hunting. I'm talking about the serial killer who strangled at least 51 women in Chicago over 2 decades. Their bodies discarded in alleys like trash. The Phantom who executed store clerks across 5 states in broad daylight with surgical precision. The predator who turned a stretch of Canadian highway into a graveyard for Indigenous women. The FBI estimates there are between 25 and 50 active serial killers operating in the United States at any given time. Some will eventually be caught, some will die before justice finds them, but many, too many, will simply disappear into the statistical darkness of cold case files, leaving behind only questions, composite sketches, and DNA samples that match no one. These are the ones who got away. The ones who might be watching this video right now. This is Criminal Minds Archives, and tonight we're investigating 7 of the most terrifying serial killers still on the loose. Real cases, real victims, real monsters who've never answered for their crimes. Fair warning, what you're about to hear is deeply disturbing. These aren't Hollywood villains or fictional characters. These are documented cases of human evil. Crimes so brutal, so senseless, that they've haunted investigators for decades. Before we begin, I want you to understand something. Behind every case number, every body count, every pin on an investigator's map, there's a person, a daughter, a mother, a son, someone's loved one who walked out the door one day and never came home. This investigation is for them, for the 51 women whose murders in Chicago went largely ignored because society deemed their lives less valuable, for the store clerks who died doing nothing more than showing up to work, for the families still waiting for answers decades later. Their stories deserve to be told. Their killers deserve to be named. Let's begin. January 4th, 2001. A body is discovered in an alley on Chicago's South Side. 32-year-old Angela Ford. Strangled, partially clothed, discarded like garbage. At the time, investigators treated it as an isolated incident. One more tragic statistic in a city that averages over 500 murders a year. They had no idea they were looking at victim number 1. Over the next 17 years, 50 more women would die the exact same way. Welcome to the case of the Chicago Strangler, a killer, or possibly multiple killers, who turned America's 3rd largest city into a hunting ground for nearly 2 decades. And the most disturbing part? Most people have never even heard of it. Between 2001 and 2018, at least 51 women between the ages of 18 and 58 were murdered by strangulation or asphyxiation in Chicago. Not scattered randomly across the city. Concentrated in 3 police districts on the south and west sides, neighborhoods like Englewood, Washington Park, and Garfield Park. Areas already plagued by poverty, drug addiction, and violence. The pattern was chillingly consistent. Nearly all victims were found outdoors, in alleyways, abandoned buildings, dumpsters, empty lots. Most were black women. Many struggled with addiction or worked in survival sex work. About 3/4 of the victims showed evidence of sexual assault. They were found partially or completely disrobed, their clothing torn to expose their bodies. And in almost every case, the killer used his hands. Manual strangulation, the most intimate personal method of murder. A method that requires the killer to watch his victim die, to feel the life drain from her body. Psychiatrists say strangulation has a powerful sexual component for certain predators. It's about control, domination, watching someone's final moments. Here's what makes this absolutely terrifying. For 16 years, nobody noticed. The murders followed a disturbing timeline. 6 women in 2001, 6 more in 2002, 8 in 2003. The killings peaked in the mid-2000s, then slowed but never stopped. 1 in 2008, 4 in 2009, then sporadic cases through 2014, and then silence. For 3 years, the strangulations stopped completely, from 2014 to 2017. Not a single case matching the pattern. Some experts believe the killer was incarcerated for an unrelated crime. Others think he may have moved away, died, or simply gone dormant. But in 2017, the nightmare resumed. 2 more women, then 4 more in 2018, all following the exact same MO. It wasn't until November 2017 that anyone connected the dots. And it wasn't the Chicago Police Department. It was a non-profit organization called the Murder Accountability Project, led by a former investigative journalist named Thomas Hargrove. MAP uses proprietary algorithms to analyze FBI homicide data, looking for statistical patterns that suggest serial killer activity. The algorithm sorts unsolved murders by location, victim demographics, and method of killing. When it flags a cluster with unusually low clearance rates and eerily similar characteristics, it raises a red flag. In Chicago, the algorithm found something shocking. Over 50 unsolved strangulations of women in the same geographic area over 17 years. In a city where more than 80% of homicides involve firearms, strangulation accounts for less than 5% of murders. The statistical probability that 50 separate killers all independently chose manual strangulation, all targeted the same type of victim, all disposed of bodies in the same manner, in the same neighborhoods? Virtually impossible. These 51 women were not killed by 51 separate men. Let me paint you a picture of what we're talking about here. These weren't quick, random killings. These were calculated, brutal murders. Take the case of Nancy Walker. On January 18, 2003, the young woman missed a lunch appointment with her sister and was never seen alive again. Nearly 2 months later, her dismembered body was found stuffed into garbage bags, dumped on the side of a road like trash. Some victims were bound and gagged. Others had plastic bags tied over their heads. Some were set on fire after death. One woman was found strangled and dismembered. Nearly all were stripped of their clothing. Angela Ford, the first known victim, never actually died in 2001. She was found strangled and unconscious, clinging to life. She spent 1.5 years in a coma before finally succumbing to her injuries. Her family watched her fade away slowly, trapped in that twilight between life and death, unable to tell anyone what happened to her. Diamond Turner was discovered by a garbage collector in March 2017, stuffed in a dumpster. It took police nearly 3 years to arrest a suspect, and only after DNA evidence finally came back from the overworked state lab. The man charged with her murder was suspected in at least 2 other strangulations. But he's the only person who's ever been charged in connection with any of these 51 murders. The Chicago Police Department has consistently denied that a serial killer is responsible. They claim the murders are unrelated, committed by different perpetrators, just a coincidence of similar victim profiles and methods in the same neighborhoods over nearly 2 decades. But the evidence tells a different story. Thomas Hargrove and the Murder Accountability Project identified something else, a geographic pattern so precise it's almost impossible to dismiss. On Chicago's near south side, the body recovery sites form an almost perfect north-south line. Not scattered, not random, a line. Serial killers often operate within specific comfort zones, areas they know well, where they feel safe. The clustering of these murders in just 3 police districts, the consistency of the disposal sites, the methodical nature of the crimes, it all points to someone with intimate knowledge of these neighborhoods. There's another theory that's even more disturbing. Some experts believe we're not looking at one Chicago Strangler. We might be looking at three. Analysis of the victim demographics suggests different offender profiles. Roughly 3/4 of the victims were black women. The remaining quarter were white or Hispanic. The Murder Accountability Project suggests that at least one killer is white and at least two are African American, based on victimology patterns in geographic clustering within the already small target area. It's also possible that one of these killers is already behind bars, just not for these murders. Yusmal, in 2014, about 30 miles east of Chicago, in Gary, Indiana, police arrested 43-year-old Darren Dion Van. He'd strangled multiple women and dumped their bodies in abandoned buildings, the exact same MO as the Chicago cases. During his interrogation, Van made a chilling confession. He admitted to keeping a wire on him at all times for his murder urges. He said his victims were random, and he told police he'd killed women in Illinois. He led investigators to 6 bodies they didn't even know were missing. When asked specifically about the Chicago murders, Van said there were a lot more victims there, but refused to provide details. To this date, Van has never been conclusively linked to any of the 51 Chicago strangulations, but the similarities are impossible to ignore. Here's the part that should haunt all of us. These murders were ignored for 16 years because of who the victims were. When Roosevelt University journalism professor John Fountain assigned his students to investigate these cases, he said something that cuts to the heart of this tragedy. "I am convinced that if there were 51 dogs killed in the city of Chicago, people would be up in arms. But we aren't. These women were marginalized, vulnerable. Many struggled with addiction. Many were sex workers. Most were black. They lived in neighborhoods that society has largely written off. And when they died, their deaths were treated as inevitable, unimportant, not worth the resources to investigate properly. Their bodies were found and logged, case files were opened, and then nothing. No press conferences, no task forces, no citywide alerts. Just 51 women who vanished from streets where death is already commonplace, and nobody noticed the pattern for 16 years. In 2021, Discovery Plus released a 3-part documentary called The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler. Director Jennifer Anderson said the series was greenlit during America's long overdue conversation about systemic racism and how black women's deaths and disappearances don't receive the same attention as other cases. Unfortunately, in our society, black women are the least of us. So when crimes happen as horrific as what has occurred over these 20 years with these ladies, their cases don't get the attention they deserve. The documentary and subsequent journalism projects like Unforgotten 51 by Roosevelt University students have worked to do what the system failed to do. Humanize the victims. Give them names. Tell their stories. Remind the world that they were mothers, daughters, sisters, human beings who mattered. Reverend Robin Hood, a Chicago activist who's been raising awareness about these cases for decades, had this to say: "Movement is starting to happen. If you put a light on something, eventually it's going to be seen." As of November 2025, the Chicago Strangler case remains unsolved. No arrests, no suspects publicly named, no closure for the families of 51 murdered women. Chicago police claim they're reviewing the cases. They say there's not enough evidence to confirm a serial killer is responsible. But they also admit their crime lab is overwhelmed, their DNA processing backlogged, their resources stretched thin across a city drowning in violent crime. The truth is this: whether it's one killer or three, whether Darren Dion Van is involved, or these are 51 separate murderers who all coincidentally chose the same method in the same neighborhoods over 17 years, it doesn't change the fundamental horror. 51 women are dead. Someone killed them, and that someone or those someones has never been caught. They're still out there. And the most terrifying question of all, did the strangulations really stop in 2018? Or have they simply gone back underground, unnoticed, unreported, adding to a body count that society has already proven it's willing to ignore? 51 lives. 51 unsolved murders. A city that failed to notice for 16 years. But Chicago isn't the only place where killers have operated with impunity. Our next case takes us to the American heartland, to a stretch of interstate highway where, In the spring of 1992, a Phantom with a World War I pistol executed 6 people in 29 days, and then vanished without a trace. April 8, 1992. 7325 Pendleton Pike, Indianapolis, Indiana. Payless shoe source. 26-year-old Robin Fuldauer wasn't supposed to be working that Wednesday afternoon. A coworker had called in sick, and Robin, always willing to help, volunteered to cover the shift. She was the store manager, salutatorian of Lawrence Central High School, a 1988 graduate of Indiana University. Smart, ambitious, beloved. She wanted nothing more than to get married and start a family. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, customers walked into the store and made a horrifying discovery. Robin lay dead in the storage room at the back of the Payless, shot in the back of the head, execution style, about $100 missing from the cash register. At first, police treated it as a tragic robbery gone wrong, an isolated incident. They had no idea they were looking at the first victim of a serial killer who would terrorize the entire Midwest over the next 29 days. 3 days later, April 11th, 1992, Wichita, Kansas, 685 miles west of Indianapolis. La Bride d'Elegance Bridal Shop. Patricia Magers, 32, owned the store with her husband. Patricia Smith, 23, worked there. They were staying late after hours to accommodate a customer who needed to pick up a cummerbund for a wedding. It was the kind of personal service that small businesses pride themselves on. A man walked into the shop. The customer, who was still there, heard 3 pops. Sharp, quick sounds that didn't quite register as gunshots. When he turned around, both women were on the floor. The stranger with reddish hair and lazy-looking eyelids was walking calmly toward the door, an Uzi-style pistol in his hand. The killer looked directly at the witness and said something chilling. "You should leave." The customer, frozen in terror, stood his ground. The killer could have executed him too. Instead, he simply walked out the door and disappeared into the Kansas night. The customer was so frightened, he didn't report what he'd seen for over an hour. But when he finally called police, he provided one of the only eyewitness descriptions investigators would ever get. 16 days later, the killer struck again. April 27, 1992. Terre Haute, Indiana, just 80 miles from Indianapolis. Sylvia's Ceramics, a small shop on a busy stretch of Highway 41, right near Interstate 70. 40-year-old Michael McCown was running his mother's store that afternoon. Sylvia, his mother, had named the business after herself. Mick was slightly built, with long brown hair tied back. Around 4 o'clock, someone walked into the store. Minutes later, Mick was dead, shot point blank in the back of the head from just 4 inches away. Here's the disturbing part. Mick was the only male victim. Investigators believe the killer chose the store because of its name, Sylvia's Ceramics, assuming a woman would be working there. He may have mistaken Mick for a woman due to his long hair and slender build. By the time the killer realized his mistake, he was already inside. He shot Mick anyway and fled. By this point, detectives in Indianapolis and Terre Haute were comparing notes. The stores were only about 80 miles apart. The victims were shot in the head, minimal cash taken, no sexual assault. When they ran ballistics on the recovered shell casings, they got a hit. Same gun, same ammunition. They were dealing with a serial killer. May 3, 1992, St. Charles, Missouri. Boot Village, a western wear store in the Bogey Hills Plaza. 24-year-old Nancy Kitzmiller, a graduate of Fort Zumwalt High School and Oklahoma State University, wasn't supposed to work that day either. Like Robin Fuldauer, she'd volunteered to cover for a coworker. She was young, bright, full of potential. Customers found her body in the back room, shot in the head, cash missing, same gun, same method. 4 days later, May 7th, 1992. Raytown, Missouri, just outside Kansas City. The Store of Many Colors, a gift shop owned by Sarah and Sonny Blessing. 37-year-old Sarah Blessing was working alone that afternoon. The owner of the video store next door saw a man with reddish hair walk into Sarah's shop. He heard a sharp pop. Seconds later, the man walked back out, climbed a hill toward Interstate 70, and vanished. When the video store owner went to check on Sarah, he found her dead on the floor, shot in the head. Her dream, running a small business with her husband, ended in seconds by a stranger with a gun. 6 people, 5 crime scenes across 4 states, 1,300 miles of Interstate 70, 29 days. And then, as suddenly as it started, the killing stopped. The FBI immediately began profiling the killer. They analyzed every detail: victim selection, geographic pattern, weapon choice, method. What they found was deeply unusual. Serial killers typically have clear motives: sexual gratification, financial gain, power, and control. The Zodiac Killer wanted attention. Ted Bundy fed a violent sexual compulsion. BTK craved dominance over his victims. But the I-70 Killer? He didn't fit any known profile. He barely stole anything, usually less than $100. He didn't sexually assault anyone. He didn't torture or mutilate. He simply walked in, shot his victim in the back of the head, and left. Quick, efficient, cold. FBI profiler Larry Ankrum admitted he'd never seen anything like it. There was no obvious motive, no sexual component, no financial desperation that would explain why someone would kill 6 people for a few $100s total. The weapon was equally puzzling. Ballistics identified it as a rare German pistol, an Irma Werke ET-22, a World War I, era target pistol with a 12-inch barrel. Only 6,500 were ever made. It's not the kind of gun you buy on the street. It's the kind of gun that gets passed down through families, kept in basements, inherited from a grandfather who served in the war. The FBI profiler theorized that the killer had an emotional connection to the weapon. Maybe it belonged to his father or grandfather. Maybe it represented something deeply personal. But why would someone use a rare, traceable, barely functional 70-year-old pistol on a murder spree? Investigators also discovered something bizarre about the ammunition. The shell casings recovered from all 6 crime scenes had traces of jeweler's rouge on them, a fine polishing compound used to clean and shine metal. Someone had carefully cleaned and maintained these bullets. This wasn't a street criminal grabbing a gun and committing crimes of opportunity. This was someone methodical, someone who prepared, someone who cared for his weapon like a craftsman cares for his tools. Police developed a composite sketch based on the witness testimony from Wichita and other sightings. The I-70 Killer was described as a thin white male, mid-20s to mid-30s in 1992, about 5'7" to 5'9", with sandy blonde or reddish hair cut short, a medium build, and distinctive lazy-looking eyelids, a detail that appeared in multiple witness accounts. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, Dark Minds, People Magazine Investigates. Tips flooded in, thousands of them. Everyone was followed up. Everyone led nowhere. Over the years, multiple suspects emerged. Herb Baumeister, a suspected serial killer from Westfield, Indiana, who murdered at least 11 men and dumped their remains along Interstate 70. He physically resembled the composite sketch, with reddish hair and a similar build. But Baumeister's victims were all men he'd picked up in gay bars, and he committed suicide in 1996 before he could be questioned about the I-70 murders. Donald Waterhouse was investigated. He'd killed his mother and stepfather in Tennessee just weeks before the I-70 murders began. But he didn't match the physical description. Wrong height, wrong hair, wrong age. Sean Patrick Goebel, arrested in 1995 for murdering 4 women across multiple states, was briefly considered. But his MO was different. His victims were different. He was ruled out. And then, in September 1993, 16 months after Sarah Blessing's murder, the nightmare resumed. Or it might have. Fort Worth, Texas, September 25, 1993. Emporium Antiques. 51-year-old Mary Ann Glasscock was found shot to death in her store. The location, right off a major interstate. The victim, a woman working alone. The method, shot in the head, minimal cash taken. 2 months later, November 1st, 1993. Arlington, Texas, a dance apparel store. 22-year-old Amy Vess was shot to death at work. Same pattern, same victim profile, same execution style killing. Then on January 15, 1994, something unprecedented happened. Houston, Texas, Alternatives gift shop. Vicky Webb was shot in the back of the head while working alone. But Vicky survived. When she described her attacker to police, she said he matched the composite sketch of the I-70 killer perfectly. Texas authorities, however, were not convinced. Different guns were used in the Texas shootings. The ballistics didn't match. They treated the cases as unrelated. But retired Indianapolis homicide detective Mike Crook, who spent 30 years hunting the I-70 killer, visited all the crime scenes himself. He drove the routes, he studied the patterns, he interviewed witnesses. His conclusion: it has to be him. The locations, all off major interstates. The victims, women working alone in small specialty shops. The method, execution-style headshots. The thefts, minimal or nothing. The geographic progression, moving southwest from the Midwest into Texas. Bob Cyphers, a veteran journalist who wrote the book Dead End. Inside the hunt for the I-70 serial killer, interviewed Vicki Webb, the Texas survivor. She told him the same things she told police in 1994. The man who shot her looked exactly like the I-70 killer. But if the Texas murders are connected, it raises a horrifying question. Why did the killer change weapons? Did he lose access to the Irma work pistol? Was it getting too hot, too traceable? Or was this someone else entirely, mimicking the pattern? In 2021, nearly 30 years after the murders, police departments from Indianapolis, Wichita, Terre Haute, St. Charles, and Raytown formed a task force. They brought in new technology, advanced DNA analysis, genealogical databases, digital forensics. They released age-progressed sketches showing what the killer might look like today. A thin man in his 50s to 70s, with sandy blonde or reddish hair and those distinctive lazy eyes. Detective Kelly Rhodes was hired by the St. Charles Police Department with a single assignment: find the I-70 killer. It's his only case, his sole focus. In 2024, Rhodes said something that offers a glimmer of hope. Things that we didn't think we'd be able to do when we first started this case. Well, now, we think we can do it. New DNA techniques, genetic genealogy, the same technology that finally caught the Golden State Killer. It's being applied to the I-70 case right now. But as of November 2025, no arrest has been made, no suspect publicly identified. The St. Charles Police Department is offering a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Robin Fuldauer never got to start the family she dreamed of. Patricia Magers and Patricia Smith never saw the couples they helped get married walk down the aisle. Mick McCown never got to tell his mother he was sorry for taking her shift that day. Nancy Kitzmiller's kindness in covering for a coworker cost her everything. Sarah Blessing's dream of running a small-town shop with her husband died with her on that floor. Many of their family members have passed away without ever seeing justice. Sarah's husband, Sonny, Patricia Smith's father, Bob Trendle, both of Mick McCown's parents. They died waiting for answers that never came. The I-70 killer. Whoever he is might be dead by now. He'd be in his 50s or 60s at minimum, possibly older. Or maybe he's in prison for something else. His connection to these murders still unknown. Or maybe he's out there right now, living a normal life, going to work, paying his taxes, attending family gatherings, sleeping peacefully at night while the families of 6 innocent people still wait for the phone call that might never come. Somewhere that rare World War I pistol might still exist. Maybe in a basement, maybe at the bottom of a lake, maybe in an evidence locker with no name attached to it. And somewhere a man with lazy-looking eyes and reddish hair knows exactly what happened on Interstate 70 in the spring of 1992. He's the only one who does. 6 victims in 29 days. A methodical killer with a rare antique pistol who vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. But what happens when a killer doesn't operate for weeks or months, but for decades? What happens when the hunting ground isn't a few stores along an interstate, but an entire highway stretching through 700 kilometers of wilderness? Our next case takes us north to Canada, where a stretch of road has been swallowing women whole for over 50 years, where at least 40 Indigenous women have vanished or been murdered, where multiple killers have been caught, but many more remain free. Welcome to the Highway of Tears. Imagine a stretch of highway cutting through dense wilderness. 724 kilometers of asphalt winding through mountains, forests so thick that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy. Towns separated by hours of driving, with nothing but trees and silence between them. No cell phone service, no streetlights, no witnesses. Now imagine that this highway has been swallowing women whole for over 50 years. Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada. The locals call it the Yellowhead Highway, but to the families of at least 40 women, most of them Indigenous, it has another name, the Highway of Tears. This isn't a case about one serial killer. This is something far more complex, far more disturbing. This is a story about systemic failure, about women whose lives society deemed disposable, and about a killer, or killers, who understood that perfectly. The Highway of Tears stretches from Prince George to Prince Rupert in northern British Columbia. It's one of the most isolated stretches of road in Canada. Communities hours apart, surrounded by wilderness so vast you could disappear and never be found. For decades, it's been the only lifeline connecting remote Indigenous communities to larger towns where people work, shop, go to school. And for decades, women have been vanishing along it. The official count from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, is 18 cases between 1969 and 2006. But Indigenous organizations say the real number is closer to 40, maybe 50, maybe more. The first known victim was Gloria Moody, who went missing in 1969. She was just 24 years old. Her body was never found. Then came Monica Ignace in 1974, 16 years old, hitchhiking from Terrace to Prince Rupert to visit her sister. She vanished without a trace. Delphine Nicole, 16, disappeared in 1990 while hitchhiking the same route. Ramona Wilson, also 16, vanished in 1994. Her body was found nearly a year later in a wooded area near Highway 16. Alberta Williams, Roxanne Thiara, Ayala Sarek Auger, Tamara Chipman, Nicole Hoare, all gone, all on or near Highway 16. Lauren Leslie, just 15 years old, murdered in 2010. The victims follow a pattern. Young women, predominantly Indigenous. Many were hitchhiking, not because they were reckless, but because they had no other choice. Northern British Columbia has almost no public transportation. Communities are isolated. If you need to get somewhere, to work, to school, to visit family, you either have a car or you hitchhike. For Indigenous communities living in poverty, hitchhiking wasn't a risk, it was survival. And someone, or multiple someones, knew that. The RCMP's response to the Highway of Tears cases has been at best inadequate. At worst, it represents a systemic failure rooted in racism and indifference. For decades, these disappearances weren't treated as connected. When Monica Ignace vanished in 1974, police told her family she'd probably run away. When Ramona Wilson's body was found in 1995, investigators treated it as an isolated case. When women kept disappearing year after year, the RCMP maintained there was no evidence of a serial killer. It wasn't until 1998, nearly 30 years after Gloria Moody disappeared, that the RCMP even opened an investigation looking at Highway of Tears cases as potentially connected. In 2005, the RCMP finally launched Project Ipana, named after an Inuit goddess who cares for the dead. The task force started with 3 cases. By 2007, it had expanded to 18. The unit was given over $5 million in funding. But by 2014, that funding had been slashed to just over $800,000. And despite all the resources, all the years of investigation, Ipana has solved precious few cases. The RCMP's official position? There's no evidence of a single serial killer. They believe multiple perpetrators are responsible for the disappearances and murders along Highway 16. And you know what? They might be right. Because unlike other serial killer cases where you're hunting one monster, the Highway of Tears appears to be a hunting ground for multiple predators. Several killers have been connected to Highway of Tears cases. Men who understood that Indigenous women traveling alone on remote highways were vulnerable, invisible, easy prey. Bobby Jack Fowler, an American drifter, rapist, and serial killer, worked for a roofing company in Prince George in 1974, the same year Monica Ignace disappeared. In 2012, DNA evidence linked Fowler to the murder of 16-year-old Colleen McMillan, who was last seen hitchhiking on Highway 16 in August 1974. Her body was found in a wooded area, sexually assaulted and strangled. Fowler was also suspected in the deaths of Gail Ways and Pamela Darlington, but he died in an Oregon prison in 2006 before he could be charged. Oregon authorities believe Fowler may have killed as many as 7 women in the Pacific Northwest. But Fowler couldn't have been responsible for all the Highway of Tears cases. He was in prison during some of the disappearances, and the murders continued long after his death. Cody Legebokoff, Canada's youngest serial killer, was convicted in 2014 of murdering 4 women near Prince George between 2009 and 2010. He was only 20 years old when he killed Lauren Leslie, a legally blind 15-year-old girl he met online. Her body was found on a logging road off Highway 16. Legebokoff also murdered Jill Stuchenko, Cynthia Moss, and Natasha Montgomery, all women in their 20s and 30s, all from communities along the Highway of Tears. But Legebokoff wasn't even born when most of the earlier victims disappeared. Gary Taylor Hanlon, a 67-year-old convicted violent sexual predator, was charged in 2014 with the murder of 12-year-old Monica Jack, who vanished while riding her bike near Merritt, British Columbia in 1978. Though not technically a Highway 16 case, Monica's murder fit the pattern. An Indigenous girl, vulnerable, preyed upon by a man who knew the system wouldn't protect her. Edward Dennis Isaac, Brian Peter Arp, other names, other predators, all operating in the same region during the same decades. And yet, despite these convictions, 15 Highway of Tears cases remain officially unsolved. So who are the other killers? Are they truckers who drive the route regularly, using the highway's isolation as cover? Are they locals who know the terrain, the back roads, the places where a body can disappear forever into the wilderness? In 2016, the RCMP admitted something chilling. They may never find the killers responsible for the remaining unsolved cases. Too much time has passed. Witnesses have died. Evidence has degraded. The killers themselves might be dead. But there's another layer to this tragedy that makes it even more devastating. The Highway of Tears isn't just about serial killers. It's about a society that created the perfect conditions for those killers to operate unchecked. Canada has a dark history with its Indigenous population. Residential schools that forcibly remove children from their families, destroying language and culture. Systematic poverty that trapped communities in cycles of addiction and violence. A justice system that consistently failed to protect Indigenous women and girls. According to official statistics, Indigenous women in Canada are murdered at 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. Between the 1960s and 2016, more than 500 Indigenous women were murdered or went missing across Canada. Half those cases remain unsolved. The Highway of Tears became a national symbol of this crisis. Many of the victims came from communities ravaged by poverty and the legacy of residential schools. They hitchhiked because there was no bus service, no affordable transportation. They were sex workers because economic opportunities didn't exist. They were addicted to drugs because trauma and hopelessness were generational. And when they disappeared, the RCMP often assumed they'd simply moved on, run away, chosen to leave. Gladys Reddick grew up in northern British Columbia. She knew about the Highway of Tears disappearances since she was a child. They were just part of life in the region, something everyone knew about but nobody talked about openly. In 2005, her niece, 22-year-old Tamara Chipman, went missing on Highway 16. Radek told reporters, "The RCMP have always been in denial that there is a Highway of Tears." She spent nearly 2 decades advocating for the missing women, organizing annual Walk for Justice events, demanding answers from authorities who seemed content to let Indigenous women vanish without consequence. Florence Natsul came up with the name Highway of Tears during a 1998 vigil for missing women. She watched families, mostly Indigenous families, crying over loved ones who disappeared along Highway 16. She saw the pattern that authorities refused to acknowledge. The name stuck, and finally, after decades, it forced people to pay attention. In 2016, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau allocated $30 million to investigate the murders and disappearances and to improve conditions along Highway 16. He acknowledged what Indigenous communities had been saying for decades. Poverty, Lack of public transportation and systemic racism created the perfect environment for predators. But even with renewed funding, even with public awareness, the RCMP admitted they might never solve the remaining cases. British Columbia has the lowest murder clearance rate of any major Canadian province, only 49% compared to 39% nationally. The Highway of Tears cases are a major reason why. Let me tell you about Ramona Wilson. She was 16 when she disappeared in June 1994, walking home from a friend's house in Smithers, British Columbia. Ramona was described as bubbly, full of life, the kind of girl who lit up a room. Her body was found nearly a year later in a wooded area off Highway 16. She'd been murdered. A documentary filmmaker, Christine Welsh, made a film called Finding Dawn about Ramona's case. Welsh's work highlighted a horrifying statistic. In the 30 years before 2006, an estimated 500 Indigenous women went missing or were murdered in Canada. Ramona's family never got justice. Her killer was never caught. Alberta Williams was 24 when she vanished in August 1989. She was hitchhiking from Port Hardy to visit her daughter, who was living with relatives. Alberta never arrived. Her sister, Bernadette, has spent over 30 years searching for answers. She's contacted the RCMP hundreds of times. She's organized searches. She's refused to let her sister become just another statistic. In an interview, Bernadette said, "Nobody cared when an Indian girl went missing." Nobody. Nicole Hoare was different from most Highway of Tears victims in one crucial way. She was white, 25 years old, a tree planter from Red Deer, Alberta. In June 2002, she was hitchhiking from Prince George to Smithers to visit her sister. Nicole vanished. Her body has never been found. But Nicole's disappearance finally brought national attention to the Highway of Tears. Suddenly, major news outlets were covering the story. Search parties were organized. The RCMP increased resources. Indigenous families noticed the difference. When their daughters disappeared, there were no helicopters, no search dogs, no press conferences. But when a white woman vanished on the same highway, suddenly it was a national crisis. It's a bitter reality that shouldn't be true, but it is. As of November 2025, at least 15 Highway of Tears cases remain unsolved. The RCMP's Project Ipana continues to investigate, but with limited resources in cases spanning over 50 years, the chances of solving them all are slim. Some killers have been caught and convicted. Bobby Jack Fowler, Cody Legabokoff, Gary Hanlon, Edward Isaac, Brian Arp, but they account for only a fraction of the victims. The rest, their killers walk free. Maybe they're dead now. Maybe they moved away. Maybe they're still driving Highway 16, looking for the next vulnerable woman, knowing that in a region where Indigenous women have been disappearing for 5 decades, one more disappearance won't raise any alarms. In December 2024, Highway 16 finally got cellular phone service along its entire length, something that should have been installed decades ago. It's a small step, but for the families of 40 women who vanished before cell towers were ever considered a priority, it's a reminder of how little their loved ones mattered to the system meant to protect them. The Highway of Tears isn't just about serial killers. It's about the conditions that allowed those killers to operate with impunity for half a century. It's about systemic racism, economic inequality, and a justice system that failed the most vulnerable. And it's about 40 women, daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, who walked out the door one day and never came home. Someone knows what happened to them, multiple someones, and most of them will never be held accountable. 40 women, 50 years, multiple killers. A highway that continues to claim lives because society deemed those lives unworthy of protection. But what happens when the victims aren't ignored because of their race or economic status, but because of who they loved? Our next case takes us to San Francisco in the 1970s, to a time when being openly gay could destroy your career, your family, your entire life. To a killer who exploited that fear. A killer who sketched portraits in gay bars, charmed his victims with art, then brutally murdered them. A killer police identified, but could never prosecute because the survivors refused to testify. Welcome to the case of the Doodler. San Francisco, 1974. The Castro district is alive with possibility. Just 5 years after the Stonewall riots launched the modern gay rights movement, the city has become a sanctuary for LGBTQ people from across America. Young men and women flee conservative towns, abusive families, and discriminatory laws to find community, acceptance, and freedom in San Francisco's vibrant gay neighborhoods. The bars are packed. The Cabaret Club, the Cinch Saloon, Phoebe's, the Ramrod, places where gay men can dance, laugh, love, and simply exist without hiding. But in the shadows of this newfound liberation, someone is hunting. January 27, 1974. Ocean Beach. A body is discovered near Ulloa Street. 49-year-old Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, a Canadian immigrant, stabbed multiple times, defensive wounds on his hands. He'd fought back. His fully clothed body lay face up in the sand. Police treated it as an isolated incident, a mugging gone wrong, maybe a lover's quarrel. They had no idea they were looking at the first victim of one of San Francisco's most prolific and forgotten serial killers. Welcome to the case of the Doodler, a serial killer who murdered at least 6 gay men, possibly as many as 14, between January 1974 and September 1975. A killer who had a signature move so distinctive it earned him his nickname. A killer who left behind 3 surviving victims, all of whom refused to testify. And a killer who, despite police knowing exactly who he was, has never been arrested. The Doodler had a routine, a method that was almost charming until it became lethal. He'd walk into gay bars and restaurants in the Castro district, Upper Market, and Polk Gulch. He was young, between 19 and 22 years old in 1974. Black, slim build, about 5'10" to 6 feet tall. He often wore a Navy-type watch cap pulled low over his head, and he carried a sketch pad. According to witnesses and surviving victims, the Doodler would sit at a table and sketch portraits of men across the room. He was talented, a good artist. When he finished a drawing, he'd approach his subject with a simple line. Like my doodle? It was disarming, flattering, a conversation starter in an era when meeting other gay men required subtlety and code. Who wouldn't be charmed by a young artist offering them a personalized sketch? The Doodler told at least one victim that he was a cartoonist. He seemed nice, unassuming, harmless. And then he'd suggest they go somewhere more private. 5 months after Gerald Kavanaugh's murder, another body was found. June 25, 1974. Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. 27-year-old Joseph J. Stevens, a female impersonator and comedian who performed at Finocchio's, a famous North Beach drag club. Jay was beloved in the community. He worked the crowd with wisecracks, singing and dancing. He'd last been seen at the Cabaret Club the night before. A woman walking by the lake early in the morning found him beneath a tree, savagely stabbed, front and back, beaten so badly his family could barely recognize him. 12 days later, July 7, 1974. 31-year-old Klaus Achim Christmann, a German immigrant, was discovered by a woman walking her dog. Same pattern, stabbed to death. The killings continued with horrifying regularity. May 12, 1975. 32-year-old Frederick Elmer Kappen, a nurse and Vietnam War veteran who'd earned medals for his service, found in San Francisco, stabbed through the aorta. His body had been moved about 20 feet. Disturbances in the sand told investigators he'd been killed elsewhere, then dragged. June 4, 1975. 66-year-old Harold Goldberg, a Swedish immigrant, discovered in Lincoln Park in an advanced state of decomposition. He'd been dead for about 2 weeks. Harold was older than the other victims, and his case had one unusual detail. His underwear had been taken by the killer. By mid-1975, San Francisco police finally realized they were dealing with a serial killer, and they had something rare: eyewitness descriptions. 3 men had survived encounters with the Doodler. They'd met him in bars. They'd gone with him to secluded areas, beaches, parks, for sexual encounters. And then he'd attacked them. All 3 survived. All 3 spoke to police. All 3 provided detailed descriptions that led to composite sketches. The survivors included a prominent entertainer, someone well-known enough that his identity would be instantly recognizable, a diplomat with an international career, and a third man who left San Francisco immediately after the attack and disappeared. These weren't anonymous victims. These were men with much to lose. Here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. In 1976, police identified a suspect, a young black man who fit the physical description perfectly. He frequented the same bars. He was an art student, or at least had artistic talent, and he'd been receiving psychiatric treatment for sex-related issues. Police interviewed him multiple times. According to Inspector Rhoda Guilford, the suspect seemed to be toying with investigators. He hinted about the killings. He was cooperative but never confessed. His psychiatrist confirmed to police that a patient had admitted to the murders, but doctor-patient confidentiality prevented the therapist from revealing the patient's name or providing evidence. Without a confession, police needed the surviving victims to testify. They needed them to identify the suspect in court. They needed them to go public. And that's when the case fell apart. All three survivors refused to testify. They refused to come forward publicly. They refused to out themselves in a court of law. Because in 1976, being publicly identified as gay could destroy your life. The entertainer would lose his career. The diplomat would lose his position. Both men had families, reputations, livelihoods that depended on their sexuality remaining private. Harvey Milk, the legendary gay rights activist who would be assassinated just 2 years later, publicly defended the survivors' decision. He told reporters, "I understand their position. I understand why people would refuse to talk. They were worried about losing their jobs." Milk estimated there were 85,000 gay people in San Francisco in the mid-1970s, and 20 to 25% of them were closeted. This was a time when the San Francisco Police Department had a policy against hiring LGBTQ officers, a time when police routinely raided gay bars, arrested men for dancing together, entrapped gay men in cruising areas, and publicly humiliated them. Former San Francisco supervisor Tom Amiano, a gay activist in the 1970s, explained it this way: "Why go to the police? You're not going to get any kind of justice. They've proven that our lives are not valued." Without testimony from the survivors, prosecutors couldn't build a case. The suspect was never arrested, never charged, never faced trial. And the Doodler simply disappeared. Or did he? In April 1975, before Harold Goldberg's body was even discovered, there was another victim. This one didn't fit the pattern exactly, but it was too close to ignore. 52-year-old Warren Andrews, a lawyer working for the U.S. Postal Service. He was found in a pool of blood at Land's End by a hiker. Unlike the other victims, Andrews hadn't been stabbed. He'd been brutally beaten with a rock and a tree branch. But Andrews fit the victim type: white, gay, and his body was left in a San Francisco park, just like the others. Land's End is about 1.5 miles north of Ocean Beach, where multiple Doodler victims had been found. Andrews died from his injuries a few weeks later. For decades, his murder wasn't officially connected to the Doodler case. Then, in January 2022, San Francisco police announced that Warren Andrews was now believed to be the Doodler's 6th confirmed victim. But here's the truly terrifying question: did the Doodler stop at 6? Police originally investigated 14 homicides as potentially connected to the case. 5 Tenderloin drag queens were found mutilated. 6 men were murdered after meeting their killer in sadomasochistic leather bars. 6 were described as regular businessmen or successful professionals killed after meeting someone in mainstream Castro bars. Were these all the work of one killer, or multiple killers operating at the same time? The physical evidence was inconclusive. The MOs varied slightly, but the geographic clustering, the victim demographics, the time period, it all overlapped. According to San Francisco Chronicle reporter Kevin Fagan, who's investigated the case extensively, there may also be victims in other parts of the country. In February 2019, 45 years after the first murder, San Francisco police released new information. They announced a $100,000 reward for information leading to the Doodler's arrest. They released an age-progressed sketch showing what the suspect would look like in his 60s or 70s. And they released something chilling: Audio from a 911 call made in January 1974 by a witness who found Gerald Kavanaugh's body. The caller refused to give his name to the dispatcher. Police are now asking that witness, if he's still alive, to come forward. In January 2022, the reward was doubled to $200,000. It remains one of the highest rewards ever offered for an unsolved San Francisco case. Detective Dan Cunningham spent years trying to crack the case. He reopened the investigation. He tracked down surviving family members of victims. He searched for the original police files, only to discover they were shockingly thin. Decades of evidence lost, misplaced, or never properly documented in the first place. Cunningham told the San Francisco Chronicle that he believes investigators know who the Doodler is. They think he's in his 70s now, possibly living in the East Bay area. DNA evidence from a couple of the homicides has been submitted for testing. Investigators hope that genetic genealogy, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer, might finally provide the breakthrough they need. But as of November 2025, no arrest has been made. The Doodler has never been charged with a single murder. Let me tell you about Jay Stevens' sister Melissa, who lives in the North Bay. In a 2022 interview, she said, "The fact that people are interested in it now means we're getting closer, because for years it went unnoticed." A lot of families have been terribly damaged by this act of his. Ron Huberman, the first openly gay investigator in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, vividly remembers the fear that spread through the gay community during the Doodler's killing spree. Bars that had been joyful gathering places became hunting grounds. Men who'd finally found freedom in San Francisco realized they were still vulnerable, still disposable in the eyes of a society that wouldn't protect them. Former San Francisco Mayor Art Agnos, who represented parts of the city in the state assembly during the 1970s, called that era Neanderthal when it came to treatment of LGBTQ people. Even in a supposed sanctuary like San Francisco, acceptance had sharp limits. Ann Cronenberg, Harvey Milk's campaign manager in the 1970s, put it simply, "We all thought we were in a Mecca. Like San Francisco was the place to be because there was acceptance. But the acceptance had limits." The Doodler case represents something uniquely tragic in the history of American serial killers. This isn't a case where investigators had no leads. This is a case where they had everything: surviving victims, eyewitness descriptions, a suspect, psychiatric evidence. But systemic homophobia, combined with the justified fear of the gay community in the 1970s, created a perfect storm where a serial killer could be identified but never prosecuted. 3 men survived the Doodler's attacks. 2 of them are still alive today, now in their 70s or 80s. They've never spoken publicly. They've never identified themselves. They carry the trauma of their attacks and the weight of knowing their silence allowed a killer to go free. Even though that silence was an act of self-preservation in a world that would have destroyed them for speaking. Somewhere, a man in his 70s might be sitting in his home in the East Bay, looking out the window, thinking about the sketches he drew in smoky bars 50 years ago. The young men who admired his artwork, the ones who went with him willingly into the darkness of Ocean Beach or Golden Gate Park. Maybe he's filled with remorse. Maybe he's forgotten entirely. Maybe he's dead. Or maybe he's still out there, wondering if, after 50 years, anyone still remembers the Doodler. Gerald Kavanaugh, Joseph J. Stevens, Klaus Christman, Frederick Kappen, Harold Goldberg, Warren Andrews. 6 names, 6 lives. 6 families who've waited nearly 5 decades for justice that may never come. And somewhere in San Francisco, 3 men who survived know exactly who the Doodler is, and they've never said his name. 6 gay men murdered in San Francisco, a suspect identified but never prosecuted because the survivors feared being publicly outed more than they wanted justice. Systemic homophobia allowed a killer to walk free. But what about the serial killers who didn't just evade justice? They taunted it. Who sent letters to newspapers? Who created elaborate ciphers? Who turned murder into a twisted game? Our next case is the most famous unsolved serial killer case in American history. A killer who murdered at least 5 people across Northern California. A killer who wrote letters signed with a symbol that still haunts investigators 56 years later. Welcome to the case of the Zodiac Killer. December 20th, 1968. Lake Herman Road, Benicia, California. A remote lover's lane on the outskirts of San Francisco. 17-year-old David Faraday and his 16-year-old girlfriend Betty Lou Jensen are on their first date. David has borrowed his mother's Rambler station wagon. They're parked at a gravel turnout, away from the city lights, listening to the radio. It's cold. It's dark. They're young and hopeful. A vehicle pulls up behind them. Someone gets out, approaches the car. 10 minutes later, both teenagers are dead. David shot point blank in the head while sitting behind the wheel. Betty Lou shot 5 times in the back as she tried to run away. Police found her body 30 feet from the car, face down on the gravel. The Benicia Police Department had no suspects, no motive, no witnesses. Just 2 dead kids and shell casings from a .22 caliber rifle. They called it a lover's lane murder, random violence, a robbery gone wrong. They had no idea they were looking at the first confirmed victims of America's most infamous unsolved serial killer. The Zodiac Killer, a name that has haunted investigators for over 50 years. A killer who murdered at least 5 people, possibly dozens more, across Northern California between 1968 and 1969. A killer who sent taunting letters to newspapers, threatened to blow up school buses, mailed cryptic ciphers that took decades to decode. And a killer who simply vanished. Welcome to Case 5, the most famous unsolved murder case in American history. 7 months after the Lake Herman Road murders, the killer struck again. July 5th, 1969. Blue Rock Springs Park, Vallejo, just 2 miles from where David and Betty Lou were killed. Another lover's lane, another parking lot. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and her 19-year-old friend Mike Mago were sitting in Darlene's Corvair around midnight when another car pulled into the lot. It parked, then left. Mike thought nothing of it. 10 minutes later, the car returned. This time, the driver got out, walked up to the Corvair, and without a word, opened fire with a 9mm handgun. Mike was shot 4 times in the neck, jaw, and leg. Darlene was hit 9 times. The shooter calmly walked back to his car and drove away, leaving them both to bleed out in the parking lot. Darlene died at the hospital. Mike survived and became one of only 2 eyewitnesses to see the Zodiac's face and live to tell about it. At 12:40 a.m., a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone at a gas station. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." Then he hung up. 3 weeks later, on August 1st, 1969, 3 Bay Area newspapers, the San Francisco Examiner, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, each received an identical letter. Handwritten, no return address, postmarked from San Francisco. Inside was a confession. The writer took credit for the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs murders. He included details only the killer could know: what the victims were wearing, how many shots were fired, where the bodies were positioned. But that wasn't the strangest part. Each letter also contained 1/3 of a 408-character cipher, a cryptogram made up of strange symbols, Greek letters, astrological signs, and Morse code. The writer demanded that all 3 newspapers print the ciphers on their front pages. If they didn't, he promised, he would go on a killing spree and murder a dozen people over the weekend. He signed the letters with a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, like a gun's crosshairs, like the Zodiac wheel. The newspapers published the ciphers, and the killer finally gave himself a name. 1 week later, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner. This one began with 3 chilling words. "This is the Zodiac speaking." The 408-character cipher was solved within days by a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty. They cracked the code using frequency analysis and pattern recognition. The message was horrifying. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all the people I have killed will become my slaves. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac struck again. Lake Berryessa, Napa County. Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, were college students enjoying a quiet afternoon picnic on the shore of the lake. Around 4:30 p.m., a man approached them wearing a bizarre costume, a black executioner's hood with a white circle and crosshairs sewn into the chest. Sunglasses covered his eyes. He carried a gun and a knife. He told them he was an escaped convict from Montana. He needed their car and money to get to Mexico. Brian tried to stay calm, tried to keep Cecilia calm. The man tied them both up with pre-cut lengths of clothesline, methodical, prepared, practiced. Then he pulled out the knife. He stabbed Brian 6 times in the back. He stabbed Cecilia 10 times. And then, while they lay bleeding and helpless, he walked over to Brian's white Carmen Gaia and used a black marker to draw his signature symbol on the car door, the circle with the crosshairs. Next to it, he wrote the dates and locations of his previous attacks. Then he left. Brian survived by playing dead. Cecilia died 2 days later from her wounds. That evening, a man called the Napa Police Department from a payphone outside a car wash. His voice was calm, almost bored. "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Gaia." Police traced the call. The payphone receiver was still hanging off the hook when they arrived. Fingerprints were found, but they matched no one in any database. 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac changed his pattern. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver and San Francisco State student, picked up a fare in the theater district around 9:30 p.m. The passenger asked to be taken to Washington and Maple Streets in the upscale Presidio Heights neighborhood. When the cab arrived, the passenger shot Paul in the back of the head at point-blank range with a 9mm handgun. He then tore off a piece of Paul's blood-soaked shirt, took his wallet and keys, and calmly walked north toward the Presidio. 2 teenagers saw the shooting from a window across the street. They called the police and watched as the killer wiped down the cab with a rag, methodically erasing fingerprints. San Francisco police officers Don Fook and Eric Zelms were patrolling nearby when the call came in. They were told the suspect was a black male. They drove past a white man walking north on Cherry Street, stocky build, crew cut, glasses, mid-30s. The man looked directly at them. They kept driving. Moments later, dispatch corrected the description. The suspect was a white male. Fook and Zelms turned around immediately, but the man was gone. He'd vanished into the darkness of Julius Kahn Playground. 3 days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. It began, as always, "This is the Zodiac speaking." The letter included a piece of Paul Stein's bloodstained shirt, proof that the writer was the killer. "School children make nice targets," the Zodiac wrote. "I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." The threat sent shockwaves through the Bay Area. Armed police officers began riding school buses. Parents kept their children home. The city was paralyzed with fear. The Zodiac never followed through, but the terror was real. Between 1969 and 1974, the Zodiac sent at least 18 confirmed letters to newspapers, police departments, and private citizens. Some included more ciphers. Some included diagrams and maps. Some were rambling manifestos about his philosophy of life and death. In April 1970, he sent a greeting card with a cipher inside. The Z13 cipher, only 13 characters long. It has never been solved. In November 1969, he sent what's become known as the 340 cipher, 340 characters of symbols that baffled cryptographers for over 50 years. In December 2020, a team of 3 amateur code breakers, David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, finally cracked it using advanced computer analysis. The message read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. I now have enough slaves to work for me." In his last confirmed letter, sent in January 1974, The Zodiac claimed to have killed 37 people. Investigators have only confirmed 7 victims. 5 dead, 2 survivors. The rest remain a mystery. For 56 years, investigators have chased the Zodiac's identity. Arthur Lee Allen was the only suspect ever publicly named by police. A schoolteacher from Vallejo, convicted child molester, dead since 1992. Multiple witnesses said Allen had called himself the Zodiac. He owned firearms. He lived near the crime scenes. But his DNA didn't match evidence from the letters, and he was never charged. In 2021, a group called the Case Breakers, led by 40 former law enforcement officials, including University of Maryland forensic expert Tom Moriello, announced they'd identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a house painter who died in 2018. They claimed to have 6 pieces of circumstantial evidence linking Post to the crimes, including eyewitnesses and physical evidence. But police agencies in San Francisco and Riverside have refused to release DNA evidence for testing. The case remains unsolved. Paul Haynes, a researcher for true crime writer Michelle McNamara's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, called Post the best Zodiac suspect that's ever surfaced. But best suspect isn't the same as caught. Let me tell you about Brian Hartnell, the only male victim to survive a Zodiac attack. Brian was 20 when the man in the executioner's hood tied him up and stabbed him 6 times at Lake Berryessa. He watched Cecilia, his friend, his picnic companion, get stabbed 10 times. He heard her cries. He tried to move, tried to help, but the ropes held him fast. Cecilia died 2 days later. Brian lived, but he's carried that afternoon with him for 56 years. In interviews decades later, Brian described the Zodiac's voice as calm, monotone, almost polite, like he was ordering a sandwich, not preparing to murder 2 people. Mike Mago, the other survivor, was only 19 when the Zodiac shot him 4 times at Blue Rock Springs Park. He watched Darlene Ferrin bleed out next to him. For years, he struggled with PTSD, addiction, and the weight of being one of only 2 people alive who'd looked into the Zodiac's eyes. In 1991, Mike received a phone call. A man's voice, the same calm, monotone voice from that night in 1969, said hello and hung up. Mike was certain it was the Zodiac, checking in, reminding him. Betty Lou Jensen's family buried her on Christmas Eve, 1968. She was 16. David Faraday's parents never fully recovered. Darlene Ferrin left behind a young daughter. Cecilia Shepard's family waited 2 days in a hospital, praying she'd survive, before they had to let her go. Paul Steen was working as a cab driver to pay for college. He wanted to be a teacher. The Zodiac took all of them, and he was never caught. In 2012, The Guardian reported that over 2,500 people have been investigated as possible Zodiac suspects. The San Francisco Police Department estimates they've looked into 2,500 names. Richard Grinnell, who runs the website Zodiac Ciphers, said in 2022 that about 50 to 100 new suspects are named every year. 56 years later, tips still come in. Amateur detectives still work the case. Families still wait for answers. The FBI considers the Zodiac case open. San Francisco police marked it inactive in 2004, then reopened it in 2008. It's been active ever since. Genetic genealogy. The technology that finally caught the Golden State Killer in 2018 offers new hope. DNA from the Zodiac letters exists. If police can build a family tree from that DNA, they might finally unmask the killer. But as of November 2025, no arrest has been made. Somewhere in California, there might be a man in his 70s or 80s who knows exactly what happened on Lake Herman Road in 1968. Who remembers the way Betty Lou Jensen's footsteps sounded on the gravel as she tried to run? Who can still picture Brian Hartnell's face when he realized their man in the executioner's hood wasn't joking? Or maybe the Zodiac is dead. Maybe he died decades ago, taking his secrets with him. Or maybe, and this is the most terrifying possibility, maybe the Zodiac never stopped. Maybe those 37 victims he claimed in 1974 weren't a bluff. Maybe he just got better at not getting caught. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein. 5 names carved into California history, 5 families still waiting for justice. And somewhere, a crosshair symbol, drawn in marker on a car door 56 years ago, still haunts the shores of Lake Berryessa, a reminder that some monsters never get caught. 5 confirmed victims, taunting letters, unsolved ciphers, 56 years of investigation with no arrest. The Zodiac Killer remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. But not all serial killers operate in the shadows of big cities. Some hunt in small towns. Some strike quickly and disappear before anyone realizes there's a pattern. Our next case takes us back to 1946, to the twin cities of Texarkana, straddling the Texas-Arkansas border, to a killer who wore a white mask and terrorized an entire region for 10 weeks, a killer who murdered 5 people, then vanished, a killer they called the Phantom. February 22nd, 1946, just 5 months after the end of World War II, America is celebrating. Soldiers are home, the economy is booming, life is returning to normal. But in the twin cities of Texarkana, straddling the Texas-Arkansas border, something is lurking in the darkness. 11:55 p.m., a secluded lover's lane. 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his 19-year-old girlfriend Mary Jean LeRae have just finished seeing a movie. They're parked on a quiet road, talking, laughing, young and in love. A figure approaches the car. He's wearing a white cloth mask, a burlap sack with crude holes cut out for his eyes. He's carrying a flashlight and a gun. "Get out of the car!" What happened next would terrorize an entire region for months. Jimmy was pistol whipped until his skull cracked in 2 places. Mary was brutally assaulted with the barrel of the gun. Both survived, barely, but their attacker vanished into the night like smoke. The Phantom had claimed his first victims. Over the next 10 weeks, the Phantom Killer would strike 5 times. 8 people attacked, 5 dead, an entire town paralyzed with fear. And then as suddenly as the killings began, they stopped. Welcome to Case 6, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, one of the oldest unsolved serial killer cases in American history. 3 weeks after the attack on Hollis and LeRae, the Phantom struck again. March 24th, 1946. Another lover's lane. This time, he didn't leave any survivors. 17-year-old Richard Griffin and his 15-year-old girlfriend Polly Ann Moore were found dead in Griffin's car. Both had been shot in the back of the head at point-blank range with a .32 caliber pistol. Richard's body was slumped behind the wheel. Polly Ann had been dragged from the vehicle and left on the ground nearby. The brutality shocked the community. These were children, high school kids, dead for no reason anyone could understand. 2 weeks later, April 14th, 1946, Paul Martin, 16, and Betty Jo Booker, 15. Another young couple, another lover's lane attack. Paul's body was found first shot 4 times, left in a ditch along a rural road. Betty Jo's body was discovered several hours later, 2 miles away. She'd been shot twice in the face. Her saxophone she'd been coming from a performance at the local high school was still in the back of Paul's car. Betty Jo played in the school band. She had dreams. She had a future. The Phantom took all of it. By mid-April, Texarkana was in full panic mode. Hardware stores sold out of guns and locks. At dusk, families locked themselves inside their homes. The streets emptied. Nobody went out after dark. Parents kept their children home from school. The local newspaper, the Texarkana Gazette, dubbed the killer the Phantom because he seemed to strike and vanish without a trace. The name stuck. Texas Rangers arrived. Among them was the legendary Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez, a larger-than-life figure who wore custom-tailored suits and pearl-handled revolvers. He looked like a Hollywood cowboy, and the press ate it up. But even Gonzalez couldn't catch the Phantom. May 3rd, 1946, 3 weeks after the Booker Martin murders. This time, the Phantom changed his pattern. No lover's lane, no teenagers in cars. This time, he broke into a home. Virgil and Katie Starks, married, in their 30s, lived on an isolated farmhouse 15 miles outside Texarkana. Around 10:30 p.m., while the couple relaxed in their living room, someone began shooting through the window. Virgil was killed, instantly shot twice in the back of the head while sitting in his chair reading the newspaper. Katie was shot twice in the face, but Katie was a fighter. Despite her injuries, despite the horror unfolding around her, she managed to escape through a window and run to a neighbor's house. When police arrived, they found boot prints outside the Starks farmhouse. The killer had calmly stood there, firing through the window, then walked away. Katie survived. She gave police a description, a man of medium height and build, but that was all she could remember through the trauma. And then, nothing. No more attacks, no more bodies. The Phantom simply disappeared. Investigators had a prime suspect. His name was Ewell Swinney, a career criminal with a long history of car theft, assault, and violent crime. The evidence against him was compelling. Swinney's wife initially told police that he'd confessed to the murders. She said he'd shown her the gun. She described how he'd dispose of stolen cars after each killing. But then Swinney's wife recanted. She refused to testify against her husband. Without her testimony, prosecutors had nothing solid enough to charge him. Swinney was eventually convicted on unrelated car theft charges and sentenced to life in prison. But he was never charged with the Phantom murders. Two of the lead investigators, Texas Ranger Manuel Gonzalez and Sheriff William Bill Presley, believed until their deaths that Swinney was the Phantom killer. In 2014, investigative journalist James Presley, nephew of Sheriff Bill Presley, published The Phantom Killer, unlocking the mystery of the Texarkana serial murders. After decades of research, reviewing his uncle's files, and interviewing surviving witnesses, Presley concluded that Ewell Swinney was almost certainly the killer. But almost certain isn't the same as proven, and prime suspect isn't the same as caught. There's another wrinkle to this story. On May 19, 1946, just 16 days after the Starks attack, a man named Earl McSpadden was found dead on railroad tracks near Texarkana. His body had been mutilated by a freight train. The coroner ruled it a homicide. Someone had killed McSpadden with a sharp object, then placed his body on the tracks to make it look like an accident or a suicide. Some locals believed McSpadden was the Phantom's sixth victim. Others whispered that McSpadden was the Phantom himself, that he'd committed suicide when the law closed in. Neither theory has ever been proven. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders inspired the 1976 horror film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, a fictionalized account that blurred fact and myth so thoroughly that many people today can't separate what actually happened from what Hollywood invented. The film was shot in Texarkana itself. It became a cult classic, and every year the city screens it at Spring Lake Park, one of the original crime scenes, as part of a tourism event commemorating the murders. It's a strange way to memorialize a tragedy, but for a town that lived through 10 weeks of absolute terror in 1946, maybe it's a way of reclaiming the narrative, a way of saying, we survived. As of November 2025, the Texarkana Phantom murders remain officially unsolved. Ewell Swinney died in 1993. He never confessed, never admitted anything, took whatever secrets he had to his grave. Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, Virgil Starks. 5 people murdered in 10 weeks in the spring of 1946. 4 of them teenagers' children, really with their whole lives ahead of them. The Phantom stole their futures, and he was never held accountable. 5 victims in 10 weeks. A masked killer who terrorized a town, then vanished without a trace. But what about the killers who operate in the shadows for years? Who hunt in the most isolated regions where bodies can disappear forever into the wilderness? Our final case takes us to New England, to a stretch of Interstate 91 running through New Hampshire and Vermont, to one of the most isolated regions in America, where a killer stalked women for nearly a decade. 7 women murdered, 1 survivor, decades of investigation, no arrest. Welcome to the Connecticut River Valley Killer. October 24, 1978, Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve, New London, New Hampshire. 27-year-old Kathy Milliken is a wildlife photographer. She's come to this remote nature preserve after work to photograph birds. The wetlands are beautiful, peaceful, a perfect spot to capture nature at its finest. The next morning, her body is found just yards from where she was last seen. Stabbed, at least 29 times, neck and abdomen, left in the dirt like discarded trash. Police investigate. They find no witnesses, no obvious suspects. They treat it as an isolated incident. They don't know they're looking at the first victim of a serial killer who will haunt New England for nearly a decade. Welcome to our final case. The Connecticut River Valley Killer, an unidentified predator who murdered at least 7 women between 1978 and 1987, with one survivor in 1988, along a stretch of Interstate 91 that runs through some of the most isolated wilderness in New Hampshire and Vermont. No clear motive, no definitive suspect, no arrests. Just 7 dead women and a survivor who looked into the killer's eyes and lived to tell about it. The Connecticut River Valley Killer targeted women in their late teens to late 30s. Many were hitchhiking not because they were reckless, but because in rural New Hampshire and Vermont in the 1980s, hitchhiking was often the only way to get around. The victims were abducted, taken to remote wooded areas, and stabbed repeatedly with what investigators believe was a single-edged blade, possibly a hunting knife or military knife. Most showed defensive wounds. They fought back, but they all died alone in the woods, far from help. July 25th, 1981. Mary Elizabeth Betsy Critchley, 37, a student at the University of Vermont. Betsy was hitchhiking from Massachusetts to her home in Waterbury, Vermont. A friend dropped her off at exit 13 on the Massachusetts Turnpike. She planned to hitch up Interstate 91 the rest of the way. She never made it home. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a wooded area in Unity, New Hampshire, 80 miles from where she was last seen. Due to decomposition, the medical examiner couldn't determine a definitive cause of death. May 30th, 1984. Bernice Courtemanche, 17 years old, a high school student and nurse's aide. Bernice was hitchhiking from Claremont, New Hampshire to Newport to visit her boyfriend. She never arrived. 2 years later, April 19th, 1986. Her skeletal remains were found near the Sugar River in Kellyville, New Hampshire. Multiple stab wounds. July 10th, 1985. Ava Marie Morse, 27. A single mother to a 10-year-old daughter. Ava was hitchhiking home from work along Route 12 near Claremont. On April 25th, 1986, her remains were discovered in Unity, New Hampshire, just 500 feet from where Betsy Critchley's body had been found. Her throat had been slit, multiple stab wounds. September 19, 1985. The skeletal remains of Ellen Freed, a nurse, were found in Kellyville, New Hampshire. April 19, 1986. Bernice Courtemanche's remains also found in Kellyville, just 1,000 feet from where Ellen's body was discovered. Same area, same method, same type of victim. By now, investigators knew they were dealing with a serial killer. April 15, 1986. Linda Moore, 36, was doing yard work outside her home in Saxtons River, Vermont, near Route 121. It was 2 p.m. on a sunny spring afternoon. Her husband came home an hour later. He found Linda dead on their living room floor, stabbed 25 times. Signs of a violent struggle, but no forced entry, no ransacking. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man in his early 20s, clean-shaven, round face, dark-rimmed glasses, dark hair lurking near the Moore home that day. Police created a composite sketch, but the man was never identified. January 10, 1987. Barbara Agnew, 38, a registered nurse. Barbara had been skiing with friends on Stratton Mountain in Vermont. That evening, she was driving home to Norwich. A snowplow driver found her green BMW at a rest stop on Interstate 91 in Hartford, Vermont. The door was cracked, blood on the steering wheel, blood on the back seat. Some of her belongings were found in a nearby dumpster covered in blood. On March 28, 1987, Barbara's body was found in a wooded area in Heartland, Vermont, 12 miles from the rest stop. She'd been stabbed repeatedly in the neck and chest. Defensive wounds showed she'd fought desperately for her life. August 6, 1988, 11:30 p.m., West Swansea, New Hampshire. 22-year-old Jane Borowski is driving home from a county fair. She's 7 months pregnant. She stops at a closed convenience store to buy a soda from a vending machine. A vehicle pulls into the parking lot, parks next to her. A man gets out, clean-shaven, white, blonde hair, between 30 and 40 years old, about 5'7", 150 to 160 pounds. He walks around to her car, asks if the payphone works, then without warning he grabs the door handle and tries to pull her out of the car. Jane fights, she punches him, she kicks, she screams. But he has a knife. He stabs her, again and again and again, 27 times. Jane loses consciousness. The man thinks she's dead. He leaves her there, bleeding out in the parking lot. But Jane wakes up. She crawls to her car. She drives herself to a nearby house. The residents call 911. Jane Borowski survived. So did her baby born healthy 2 months later. Jane gave police a detailed description of her attacker. She described his vehicle, an early 1980s Jeep Wagoneer with wood grain siding. She remembered 3 letters from the license plate. She helped create a composite sketch. That sketch closely matched the description from the Linda Moore murder 2 years earlier. Police had evidence, fingerprints from Jane's car, DNA from under her fingernails, a witness, a survivor. But 37 years later, no one has ever been arrested. In 1986, New Hampshire and Vermont formed a joint task force, 10 to 15 investigators, dedicated to solving the Connecticut River Valley murders. They interviewed over 500 witnesses, pursued over 200 leads. Forensic analysis revealed that the same type of blade was used in multiple murders, a single-edged knife, likely a hunting or military knife. The wounds were consistent. The dump sites followed a pattern all within a 50-mile radius along Interstate 91. But they never caught the killer. There have been suspects over the years. Michael Nicolau, a man with a violent history who lived in the area during the murders. In 2005, Nicolau murdered his estranged wife and stepdaughter, then killed himself. Investigator Lynn Marie Carty compiled extensive circumstantial evidence linking him to the Connecticut River Valley murders. When she showed Jane Borowski his photo, Jane said, "I have no doubt in my mind it was him." But Nicolau was dead. Police never confirmed his involvement. Gary Westover, a paraplegic from Grafton, New Hampshire, made a deathbed confession to his uncle in 1997. He claimed that 3 friends had abducted and murdered a woman in Vermont around the time Barbara Agnew disappeared. He said they'd loaded him and his wheelchair into their van, gone out drinking, and on the way home his friends had killed someone. His uncle reported this to authorities. Nothing was done. Westover died in 1998. His uncle died in 2006. The 3 friends were never identified. In May 2024, New Hampshire authorities executed search warrants in Newport, near where Bernice Courtemanche and Ellen Freed's remains were found decades ago. Investigators wouldn't say what they were looking for. The warrants remain sealed. As of November 2025, the case is still active. DNA evidence exists. Fingerprints are on file, but there's been no breakthrough. Jane Borowski is now in her 50s. Her daughter, the baby she was carrying that August night in 1988, is a grown woman. In a 2023 interview, Jane spoke about her attack. She said she thinks about it every day. She thinks about the 7 women who didn't survive. She thinks about the man who tried to kill her. I ended up reading in the newspaper that I was possibly a victim of the Connecticut River Valley serial killer, which was crazy to me. So they had all this evidence, but 34 years later, there's been no arrest. She still carries the scars, 27 stab wounds across her body. She still remembers his face. She still sees the Jeep Wagoneer in her nightmares. But she survived. Catherine Milliken wanted to photograph birds. Mary Critchley was hitchhiking home to Vermont. Bernice Courtemanche was going to see her boyfriend. Ellen Freed called her sister from a payphone. Ava Morse was a devoted single mother. Linda Moore was doing yard work in her own front yard on a sunny afternoon. Barbara Agnew was driving home from a ski trip. 7 women, 7 lives, 7 families who waited decades for answers. And somewhere, maybe in New Hampshire, maybe in Vermont, maybe long dead, a man knows exactly what happened to them. He's the only one who does. 7 cases, 7 killers or more who were never caught. Dozens of victims whose murders remain unsolved. The Chicago Strangler. 51 women, most of them black, most of them vulnerable, strangled and discarded over 17 years. Their deaths ignored until an algorithm finally connected the dots. The I-70 Killer. 6 people executed in broad daylight across 5 states in 29 days. A rare World War I pistol. A pattern so clear it terrified an entire region. And then, silence. The Highway of Tears. At least 40 Indigenous women vanished along a remote Canadian highway over 5 decades. Some killers caught, many still free. A system that failed to protect the most vulnerable. The Doodler. 6 gay men murdered in 1970 San Francisco. A suspect identified. Survivors who refused to testify because coming forward meant destroying their lives. Justice sacrificed to homophobia. The Zodiac Killer. 5 confirmed victims. Taunting letters. Unsolved ciphers. 56 years of investigation and still no arrest. The Texarkana Phantom. 5 dead in 10 weeks in 1946. A prime suspect who was never charged. A town that dreaded sundown. The Connecticut River Valley Killer. 7 women stabbed to death along Interstate 91. 1 survivor. Decades of investigation. No closure. These aren't stories. These are real cases. Real people. Real families still waiting for phone calls that may never come. Behind every statistic, every cold case file, every unsolved murder, there's a person who mattered. A daughter who'll never come home. A mother whose children grew up without her. A sister whose birthday goes uncelebrated. A friend whose absence leaves a permanent hole. The FBI estimates there are between 25 and 50 active serial killers in the United States right now. Some will be caught, some will die, but many, too many will simply fade into statistical darkness. Technology is improving, DNA databases are expanding, genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigation. Cases that seemed impossible to solve 30 years ago are finally seeing breakthroughs. But for every Golden State Killer caught after decades, there are dozens more who remain shadows, ghosts, names we'll never know. If you have information about any of these cases, the Chicago Strangulations, the I-70 murders, the Highway of Tears disappearances, the Doodler attacks, the Zodiac killings, the Texarkana murders, or the Connecticut River Valley murders, please contact your local law enforcement. Anonymous tips are accepted. Rewards are offered. Someone out there knows something. Maybe you saw something years ago that didn't seem important at the time. Maybe you heard a family member tell a suspicious story. Maybe you've kept a secret for decades because you were afraid. It's not too late. For the families still waiting, it's never too late. This has been Criminal Minds Archives. Thank you for bearing witness to these stories. Thank you for remembering the victims. Thank you for keeping their memories alive. Until these killers are caught, until justice is served, we'll keep investigating. We'll keep telling these stories. We'll keep reminding the world that unsolved doesn't mean forgotten. To the 51 women of Chicago, to Robin Fuldauer, Darlene Ferrin and Paul Stein, to the women of the Highway of Tears, to Joseph Stevens and Warren Andrews, to Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, to Richard Griffin and Pollyann Moore, to Kathy Milliken and Barbara Agnew, and to every victim whose name we didn't have time to say, you mattered, you still matter, and we will never stop searching for the truth.